Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. It's my pleasure to be your host today. It's also my pleasure to have with us here in the studios of GNAT, Betsy Bishop, who is the executive director of the Vermont State Chamber of Commerce. Betsy was a member of the Douglas administration before she took on that job, serving for 7 years as the deputy chief of staff under the Douglas administration, and was also the commissioner of economic development. Before that, she had her own public affairs company. She grew up in Vermont and now lives in East Montpelier. Betsy, welcome to GNAT.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Well, great to have you here, and it's amazing. It's hard to imagine, but it's not going to be all that much longer before the legislature is going to be back in session in Montpelier in January, about 6 or so weeks from now. I guess I was just wondering, to get us started, what are going to be some of the issues on the sort of the short list of concerns that the State Chamber is going to be looking at when the legislature reconvenes?
I think every year, really money is at the root of so many issues, right?
Right.
Both personally in business and no different in the legislature. So I think what happens is the state budget at $5.5 billion really drives so much of the conversations about what we can do and what we should do in the legislature. But the Vermont Chamber will be working to make sure that we keep, the costs of businesses down while promoting good things for businesses, because our focus, as you know, is to really focus on economic growth in the private sector and try to help businesses grow. And as part of that effort that we do, we look at legislation that is being proposed and enacted that will either help or harm business.
So are there any pieces of legislation that you're aware of at this point that are kind of out there, or maybe were holdovers from last year's, this past year's session? That are troublesome in some way, or ones
Sure.
you want to kind of tamp down?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things. So in the legislative session last year, we really worked very closely on an issue around marketing. So one of the things that we have done for many years, as you might be familiar with, we've really promoted tourism marketing. And there's about $2 million a year that the state appropriates for marketing to visitors outside of Vermont to get them to come to Vermont. And it's something that we lobby on every year and really try to protect that effort. But last year we brought forth a sort of a sister proposal to that, to really think about Vermont not only as a tourism destination, but as a place to live and to work and to build a business. And we were successful in getting the planning funds for that marketing effort. And this year we will be coming back and trying to make that effort go from planning to action. Because one of the things that we really strongly believe is that instead of looking at tax increases year after year, is perhaps there's a way that we could help grow the economy, get a few more people here in Vermont, get a few more businesses here in Vermont, and grow the revenues to the state in that way rather than through increasing a tax rate.
What is your assessment of the overall economy of the state? I mean, are things moving in the right direction, or are they kind of going nowhere fast?
Well, I think when you look at the numbers, the rate of growth is roughly about 2.5%, maybe 3%. And that is certainly not a booming economy. It's better than no growth, but it's really just keeping up with inflation. And therefore, we experience a lot of problems from that. So if that's the overall economic growth, there are some businesses, obviously, that are doing better than that and some that are still struggling. So when you match that with a rate of spending by the state at about 5%, you start to get that upper level rate of spending at 5%, and you start to get the economic growth at 2.5%, and it creates that gap. And that's where sort of the discussion then comes in about, well, how are we going to fill the gap? And there's really only two ways that are on the table, and that is cutting the spending, which is painful, or increasing taxes, which is painful. And it's why we continue to bring the conversation of perhaps we could talk about how we can help businesses grow. What kinds of government policies can either be rolled back or enacted that would help create a foundation and an environment for businesses to want to grow. And so that's something that we're working on, quite frankly, all year round. We focus even more on it in January when the legislature comes back, and prepared to do that now.
What As you study the numbers and look at the research on this, what is the biggest single impediment to growing a business in Vermont? I mean, why is it? I mean, in the past, it used to be Act 250 was cited, for instance, as a, just a permitting process that was just way too cumbersome and time consuming, and by the time people got their permits, if they got them, it was 3 or 4 years later, and the original rationale had changed. Is there one or two things that you can see that says, if we could just simply tweak this or change that or eliminate this requirement, we might have a chance to attract more businesses or help those who are already here to grow?
I really do wish that it was that simple, that there was, if we could just do one thing or two things, we could make growth happen. I think when you look at growth in this state and you look at the health of the economy, we look at a couple of things that are happening. We have the growth rate that I talked about 2.5%. We have an unemployment rate in this state that's about 3.7% right now, and it's been hovering there for quite some time, which on one hand is good. It's a slow rate of unemployment, but on another hand, if you have a business that's growing, it needs more employees, and there's a very small pool there. So we have a workforce issue there that is stagnating growth. Take that 3.7% and you think about our overall population is 625,000 people. You look at, when you look at our population overall, we're the only state in the nation with a declining population, and that population is aging. So when you think about needing to grow a workforce to help businesses grow, we really need to talk about how we get a few more people in Vermont. How do we recruit those people who come here and stay for a weekend? How do we get them to think about staying here for a lifetime? Bringing their ideas with them, their work ethic, their productivity, and yes, their businesses. So how do we grow those businesses? What can we do? I think the biggest impediment to business growth across sectors is uncertainty. Really trying to understand, if I make this investment to build an addition onto my business, or to grow a new sector of my business, or hire 5 new employees, is the environment going to be stable enough for my business plan to work? And I think sometimes what we have is an unstable, predictable environment. And so when you think about, you talked about Act 250 and permitting, I think that's one of those issues. So if you're in a business that needs to build something to grow, you're looking for predictability in that permitting process. And is that improving? Is that not? It really depends on the day. I think we really need to adopt a culture of, yes, we want you to grow. How can we help you get to yes in a period that makes sense for your business model? And I'm not sure we're quite there yet. It does depend on the size of the project and that. But I would also say the tax climate, the tax environment, the types of issues we're talking about. A few years ago, there was a pretty healthy and long, drawn-out discussion about, are we going to implement a 15% payroll tax here in this state? That caused a lot of uncertainty in the business community at a time when we were just starting to recover from the recession, when reserves were starting to build up. When you wanted businesses to take some of those reserves and reinvest them back into their people and their places, and to start helping the economy grow. But instead what we saw people do is say, I'm just going to hold firm here for a little while. And that I'm going to hold on to my assets is probably the right decision for that business, but it doesn't help us compel economic growth. So that kind of uncertainty, when you're talking about tax policy or permitting regulations or any of that, is probably the single biggest impediment to growth. And there's no easy answer on how to fix that, because you can't stop talking about ideas. But we're right now, there's an idea out there on the table about an 88-cent per gallon carbon tax. Now, most of the main policy leaders in the state have disregarded that and said that is just not going to happen. And I believe that. But the truth is that we're going to be talking about that a little bit this year and a little bit more next year. And again, if you're in a business that's going to impact, you're thinking about your future plans in Vermont and your future path to success and how that may or may not fit in over your 5-year or 10-year business plan.
I may be wrong on this, but my understanding of the carbon tax idea is that basically most lawmakers have said, look, that's not going to work unless it's a regional approach. If all of the states in New England and elsewhere in the area were to go along with that as well, because the state by itself couldn't take on that kind of a burden and expect.
And that's why I think it will be dismissed this year. But sometimes those types of conversations about exploring that idea is a little breathtaking.
Oh yeah, it got my attention.
It gets a lot of people's attention, and I think that's, you can't stop having those conversations, but I think that type of predictability is something that, a lot of businesses would like that.
One of the
like the predictability.
Yeah, predictability is a wonderful thing. The older I get, actually. One of the things that has been talked about a little bit down this way is the sense that the economy of southern Vermont, Bennington County, Windham County in particular, seems to be lagging behind that of more northern counties, like Chittenden is the primary example, but also Addison and Franklin counties. And I guess I just wondered if that was a sense that you shared from your perspective at the State Chamber. Do the numbers seem to bear out that feeling that, well, gee, we're not really keeping up with, other parts of the state, or is that a misconception on our part?
I think there's some truth to that. When you look at recently there was a forum around those statistics and really looking at how places in southern Vermont compare to other places, and specifically Chittenden County. And I think when you look at that, there is a disparity in numbers. I think that just a couple of weeks ago in the Burlington Free Press, there was an article in the Free Press about how a lot of the restaurants in the Burlington area are having difficulty filling kitchen help at $12 an hour. That shows you that there is a lack of people there that is constraining growth. When I told that story earlier today in Bennington County, I was told that that's happening here too. So I think those things, the same things are happening across the state, maybe at different levels. And certainly when you look at the Chittenden County economy, it sort of feels a little bit more vibrant than if you're in Bennington County or perhaps in the Northeast Kingdom. But truly, when you look at those statistics, it too has an area, a room to grow, if you will. And really what we need to drive that is just a few more people in Vermont. So we're at about 625,000. I don't know what the right number is, but if we can get a few of those visitors to think about staying here for a lifetime, bringing their capital, their investment, their ideas, and their growth, I think that's part of how we start to fuel economic growth, instead of just thinking about Vermont as a great place to come for a long weekend, which it is, and we want to continue that. We rely heavily on the tourism economy in Vermont, and we need to continue to do a good job with that. But if we can have a little bit of a conversion factor, that would be great.
So I guess similar to the question I asked earlier about what's the magic bullet here behind getting the economy to grow, is there, again, one or two key factors that you can exploit to say to those folks who may already own, let's say, a second home up here and are familiar with Vermont, have been coming to Vermont for a while, and might be persuaded to make this their home state? I mean, we talk about quality of life a lot. We say, hey, you can go hiking, you can do biking, canoeing, kayaking, and whatever.
we can't underestimate that, because when you're talking about a second homeowner or a visitor, that's why they're here, right? So they're here because they love that lifestyle. The reason they keep going back to wherever they're working is because they don't think that there's an opportunity here for them to make a living and play in that lifestyle. And I think that's what's missing for us, is telling people, building upon our reputation. We have a really strong reputation. Anywhere you go in the world, if you've ever traveled anywhere, you find that connection. People will say, oh, I have a fond memory of Vermont. I remember when I went hiking, when I went kayaking, whatever those things were. But they don't think of us as an employer. They don't think of us as a place to build a business. And, in the economic development arena, when you're recruiting businesses, you hear the stories all the time about such and such a state recruited this massive business and they threw at them millions of dollars to do that. And whenever that happens, I typically hear in Vermont, why can't we do that? Well, there's a real reason why we can't do that. We'll never be able to compete in that market for a couple of reasons. One, we will never have the amount of resources to match a New York or an Ohio to do that. And two, even if we did, which we won't, but even if we did, it probably really doesn't match Vermont to go find a massive business and plunk down somewhere, right? We're not going to, it doesn't fit into the Vermont growth strategy. Instead, our growth strategy is taking Vermont's businesses that, a big business in Vermont is a business with 40 or 50 employees. Now, certainly we have businesses that are much larger than that, but if you take a business that's 40 or 50 employees and you put a couple of strategies in place to help them grow to by 5 employees, and you've got a 10% growth rate. That's our trick. And so how do you do that? What are the things that can do that? I think workforce training, funds to help get those folks who have skills, maybe upgrade their skills a little bit, bring their current skills. If you've got somebody working in manufacturing maybe that might be 40, 50 years old, how do they move up that technology line so that they can maybe use some of the workforce training monies to help them? So I think that's a component. I think another component is we have an incentive program in the state that is little used. It's not the multi-million-dollar incentive program, but it basically says that if you create jobs and you invest capital and you do what you say you're going to do, you get a certain amount of cash back from the investment that you've made. And we've had very few people take that up. And so last year we helped expand that program and that eligibility so more Vermont-sized businesses can do that. So these aren't, you're not landing the big fish, but you're landing a lot of smaller, medium-sized fish, which is really the right answer that fits Vermont's lifestyle. So when we're looking for solutions and incentives, we're looking for ones that fit that kind of economic growth.
Okay. You mentioned shortage of qualified workers and jobs going begging or having a hard time. I mean, is the only way out of that to, let's say, offer remedial training for existing workers here, or is there another approach that maybe, tries to go into schools to students who are in high school right now and say, hey, look at, there are a lot of career opportunities out there, electricians, plumbers, all kinds of trades that you could make a good living and live in Vermont. Is that an approach that you think either the chamber or the government is open to trying to push for a little bit more?
I think so. I think currently there's a review underway on the tech centers in Vermont and trying to understand. So when we get done K through 12, you're a student and you're K through 12, what are your choices moving on to that? What are your choices in 11th grade and 12th grade? And how do you become, what are your choices once you get out of high school? And I think for many years we've thought everybody moves on to a 2-year or a 4-year and that's the best way. But the trades are something that have drastically changed. They're much more technology oriented.
Right.
And we were just in Bennington a little bit earlier today at the Career Development Center there, and they have a whole culinary aspect as well, and really training our kids to get into the food industry, which matches Vermont very well. So trying to think about what the employer wants and how we help do that. The tech centers are a really good bridge for that and helps that. But where else are we going to get the worker of the future? So first of all, making sure that all of our graduates from high school are going on into the workforce in some capacity is fine. Whether that's looking at a 2-year or 4-year degree or looking at workforce right after school, we have to look at that. But I think we need to be encouraged at looking at, I mentioned how we might encourage other people to come from away to live here. That's another place.
Right.
But we have a large number of folks who are workforce aged that are not in the workforce. And we have to figure out what's going on there and figure out how to create a path for them who are not in the workforce cycle and get them into the workforce. And doing sort of a deeper dive around programs that are supporting these people now and how can those programs incent these people to get into the workforce is another way of growing our workforce without necessarily growing our population.
Right. Just to get back to the state budget for a second,
Sure.
where we kind of began this conversation. Once again, the state is looking at a large budget gap. It seems like every year we start off in 80 or 90 million in the hole.
Yes.
And I think that's roughly around, depending on what we're talking about, the budget shortfall for the current fiscal year or looking at the next year. And as I understand it, a big part of that is Medicaid shortfall spending to the tune of $40 to $60 million, depending on some of how it works out. That being said, and for the state to come up with $60 million or so dollars, or $100 million, we may wind up having to have before it's all over, that is probably going to tend to crowd out a lot of some of the other initiatives, I think, that you might think would be wise and useful to get into, like workforce training, for instance. So how do we get around that if we're not going to raise taxes on a state that already, I think, feels itself pretty well maxed out tax-wise?
It's a difficult choice, and this is why we're in this bind, as you mentioned, year after year, where we're faced with upward pressures of state spending from programs that we have funded in the past. You have revenues that are perhaps not performing to projected levels. So we've budgeted on we've projected on higher projected levels than we should have when revenues start lagging. And it leads you into this spiral of tax increases. If we could be really honest about our budget issues and what we can afford as a state and try to close that gap permanently so that every year that's a much smaller amount. When you get to $40, $50, $60 million, whatever the number is, for a state the Vermont size, that's real money. And the pain that comes with closing that gap, either by taxing something or cutting something, is real. So I would prefer to see them to stop spending new programmatic spending or new eligibility and just worry about the funding that we have. That's one way to do it without any pain. You can't have something new. We can't expand quite there yet because our revenues haven't come up to that level yet. If we could get to that place where it's a much smaller number and the adjustment is much smaller, we could have some really great conversations about, all right, well, revenues, our budget did pretty well. We were within scope there. Now we've seen that our revenues are starting to come up. What would we like to spend this investment on? What would we like to invest in? Maybe we want to invest in our people, in the workforce area, not just in maybe human services, but how do we invest in their skills so that they can get a job in a good industry paying well? So I think those are the conversations that I'm eager to get to, and it's unfortunate that because we constantly have these large pressures of existing spending, we rarely get to those conversations.
Yeah, well, it does seem to be the annual rite of winter or whatever, that we start off with this enormous black hole that needs to get filled in first, and then there's this question of, well, can we cut this, can we cut that, can we tax this, can we tax that, and it's must be a very depressing exercise, I would imagine.
Well, it is. I guess I'm not done trying. But I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the two conversations that are had. In the budget conversation around, especially around human services, it is, well, we have these upward budget pressures. How are we going to fund that? And then on the economic growth side, we have ideas, and the answer usually is, well, we can do any ideas that don't cost any money. So we're dealing with these two very different. So it would be interesting to me to flip that and say, well, we can do any new ideas on human services as long as they don't cost any money. And maybe we can talk about some economic growth ideas. I say that in a bit provocative way because that's not going to happen. We have to take care of our people of Vermont, but we have to look at the spending trajectory there so that we can think about how we can put in place some good things to help grow the state.
Well, I'm sure, as always, it's going to be an interesting session up at the legislature in Montpelier. All kinds of unusual and unpredictable things will probably happen. But we're going to have to leave it at that for now. But I wanted to thank you again, Betsy, for taking the time to be with us today. I know it's been a busy day for you traveling around various parts of the southern part of the state. We're really happy that you were able to make the time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you all for watching as well. This has been the Front Page on GNAT TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, here with Betsy Bishop, the Executive Director of the Vermont State Chamber of Commerce. It's been our pleasure to be with you today. We'll see you the next time.